Hey there folks, so today I'm going to be doing a video and I asked people online, I said ask me any questions you've had about veganism or the vegan lifestyle or any grievances you have, or send me hate, anything you want really. And I didn't get a whole lot of questions, but I did get one that I thought was very interesting and a really great question, because it's one I really didn't think was too big of an issue until I looked into it. And that question is wool vegan? So the answer is no. So by definition, vegans don't use anything that comes from an animal, and wool comes from an animal. Now, I know what you're thinking. What's wrong with wool? I mean, we're just cutting the hair off sheep. What's so wrong with that? Well, you'd be surprised. And before I get into this, I just want to say, I know there's going to be comments out there saying, actually, in New Zealand, I went to a sheep farm and they treated their animals kindly. Listen, I'm not talking about some ranch in New Zealand, some mountain in Ireland. I'm talking about the mass production of wool that we use in most of our clothes. Because when you go to Walmart to buy a sweater, I can guarantee you that wool is not coming from some nice Irish guy, all right? That's coming from a factory-produced animal. Now, let me address something I hear a lot when I bring up wool. People say, don't sheep need to be shorn? Well, wild sheep, natural sheep, don't. So if we look at doll sheep, which is living happily in nature, they grow a perfect amount of wool. They grow a healthy amount that keeps them warm in the winters, and then they shed it off in the summer. But if we look at domesticated sheep, that's another story. So let's look at 30% of all wool in the world that comes from Australia. The most common sheep used there is called merino. Merinos have been selectively bred throughout history to have wrinkly skin and produce way more wool than is necessary. And then they can't even shed off their own wool. And that's why people say sheep need to be shorn, because we have manufactured them to be that way throughout history. Their coats are so thick that there's even been cases of merino sheep dying from heat exhaustion in the hotter months. Now, when we look at domesticated sheep that can't shed their wool themselves, something happens where flies will lay their eggs in the folds of the sheep's skin, which will then birth and turn into maggots, which will literally eat these sheep alive. To prevent this from happening, farmers will perform an operation called mulesing, which is where, without the use of anesthetics, they literally slice off pieces of skin off the backs and tails of sheep to prevent eggs from being laid on them. Sheep are sheared in the spring a little bit before they would naturally shed their coats. They're shed sooner to avoid the loss of their wool, but then when we shed them too soon, it's still too cold for them to thrive. An estimated 1 million sheep die every year to exposure to the cold. Another problem with sheep shearing is it also affects the employees that work to do this. They aren't paid by the hour. Sheep shearers are paid by the volume of wool they collect. So that leads to unrealistic timelines and stressed workers moving at a rapid pace, leading to the abuse of the animals. And lastly, once the sheep have produced their wool and they can't produce anymore, they're not seen as profitable, they're all crushed into holding pens where millions at a time are exported off to become meat. No matter where you're buying your wool from, that will end up being someone's dinner. These animals are killed after their wool is used. And for the sheep that survive the holding pens, they're crammed onto something called live export ships. This has been huge in the news recently, and I can do an entire video on live export ships, but I'll just show you some footage. This footage is shocking. There are millions of animals crammed onto these live export ships, and the lambs that are born on these ships are often trampled to death. And once they get off these ships, they're killed, just like any other slaughter animal. So, when you ask what's wrong with wool, it's not just a sweater. It's a lifetime of pain, torture, and misery ending on someone's dinner plate. Just buy a different sweater.